This is Neil Turian on April the 9th, 1973 in Anadarko, Oklahoma, and I am here to interview your given name, Rachel Briscoe, and she was born here in Anadarko and has quite a few interesting stories to tell us. And I'll turn the mic over to Rachel.
September the 25th, 1895, through high school. OCW at Chickasha, which is now OCLA, 1915.
Do you have any early recollections about the days here in Anadarko? About the Indians? Anything about the agencies and so on?
Well, we lived in the Old Town, which was then the agency, before the town of Anadarko was established. And the Indians came over to the trading posts that were there. There had two, and I remember one story that my foster father told me when he was first put on the reservation with the Indians. He went down to the post office and they saw the people getting letters, and they didn't have to pay for them. And so he asked a friend what they were doing. And he said, well, that's the way they communicated with people who lived away from here. And so then he began to, after he went back to where he stayed, he got to thinking of his childhood days before he was captured, and he finally remembered his father's name was Martinez.
Your father was captured by
the Apaches. And
you know about when that was?
Well, he was 7 years old, but I can't remember the date.
And that was in New Mexico?
In New Mexico, near Las Vegas.
What was his name, his full name?
Andres Martinez.
Martinez. And he was captured by the Apaches, and he was...
And they couldn't say Andres the way he spoke it, so they called him Andale. And that name stayed with him all through the time that he lived with the Indians, which was about 21 years. And
they traded him off to another
to the Kiowas. And the Kiowas treated him, and because the Apaches had mistreated him and was real cruel to him, but the Kiowas, an elderly woman, took care of him and healed the sores on his head. And so he stayed with the Kiowas until they were all put on the reservation here in this vicinity.
He was Mexican?
He was Spaniard. He was really, it was a mistake because he came from, his ancestors were from Castile, Spain. These are Castilian.
When they traded him to the Kiowas, what was the bargain?
That my foster he didn't know the value of the greenbacks, money, and he would just he just used greenbacks for cigarette papers. That's one of the funny things that I can remember.
Did he, your father, did they release him, the Kiowas?
Yes, when his brother, after he contacted his relatives, that's quite a long story. His brother drove through the country and came after him. After quite a bit of correspondence, and the Indians didn't want him to leave and go back to New Mexico, but they agreed to let him go if he would come back. So he stayed 4 years out there. And his mother was still living, but his father had died in the meantime. And so he stayed there with his mother, and I'm sure it was a touching scene when he walked in to see her, because he had long braids and dressed in Indian garb. And they taught him, his mother and his sisters taught him the Spanish language, which came back to him readily, and taught him arithmetic. And that's all the schooling that he ever had, was just those 4 years. And after the 4 years was up, why he came back to the Indian Agency here and met Reverend Methvin, who was an Indian missionary here from the Methodist Church. And he was converted and became an employee at the Methodist Institute, which Reverend Methvin established, a mission school for the Indian children. And he became an interpreter too for the Indian agent, because they needed someone to translate the Kiowa language. And when they put the Indians on the reservation, and allotted them the land.
You know about when that was?
Well, it was in the late 1890s, but I can't remember the date. And he, after he became converted to the Methodism, he was quite interested in helping his Indian, he always called them my Indians, and helping them to become civilized and to learn the ways of the white man. And he later became missionary to the Indians.
There was a book written about him, wasn't it?
Yes. Andley. And written by Reverend J.J. Methvin. And he worked with Reverend Methvin as an interpreter for years, and then he finally had a church out at Hog Creek and helped establish the Indian church out at Hog Creek. And spent most of his time trying to help the Indians. They always came to him for advice and help.
Well, you lived there in the parsonage, did you?
Well, we did. We lived over in Old Town in the parsonage for a while, and then he received a headright, just the same as a full-blood Kiowa, down by Verdon. His land was situated down by Verdon, and we lived there a few years, and then he sold that and came back to Anadarko, and we lived here in our own residence he built, where we live, where I live now. And he worked with the Indians in every way that he could to help them in their business affairs and religiously. And when he was stricken, he was holding a prayer meeting at an Indian friend's house out just at the edge of town here. And that was in 1935. He passed away.
A large percentage of the Indians accepted Christianity, didn't they?
Yes, a very large percentage. We had 3 Indian mission schools here, the Catholic and the Presbyterian and the Methodist.
There were missions.
Yes, they were all missions.
And they were all Indian schools.
Indian missions. Reverend Fate had the Presbyterian mission out east of town, and Reverend Methvin had his mission right at the edge of town, and the Catholic mission was out south of town, about a mile.
They're all gone now.
Yes, they're all gone. And then, of course, there was Riverside Indian School, too, but then that wasn't a mission school. That was a government school.
Mm-hmm. Well, the church is tied in pretty close with the Indians in the early days, wasn't it?
Yes, they were.
They had quite an influence on their lives.
Yes, quite a bit.
You had another item of interest about that capture of your foster father.
Yes, when he was captured by the Apaches, he and his nephew were tending sheep, and on the other side of the hill from where the father was harvesting wheat, he and his neighbors were harvesting, and he sent the boys over on the other valley to herd the sheep, and it was where they were captured. And when the boys didn't come for the noon meal, they got out to look for them, and they could see what had happened. They could see the tracks of the Indians, and they traced them for several hours, but they couldn't find any trace of them. And the little nephew was younger than Andres, and he cried, and they treated him very badly. They were cruelly treated, both of them. And so the Indian got angry because the little boy cried so much, and he threw him down on the ground and stabbed him with a spear. And Andres jumped down to try to protect him. He jumped off of the other horse, and so the Indian struck him with a spear, and he still had the scar up on his forehead, but he wasn't killed naturally, and the scar stayed with him though as long as he lived on his forehead.
You received better treatment though from the Kiowas.
From the Kiowas, and he was all sore and bruised, and this Indian lady healed it with the soapweed. That was the medicine she used. And that's about all I can think of that we left out.
This is Neil Toohey in Anadarko, and we're signing this tape off on April the 9th, 1973. Thank you.